agreement on new Patriot systems and missiles for them. We are investing in our own production, especially of drones, including interceptor drones. We will continue active drone operations on Russian territory in response to their strikes. As always, we will act asymmetrically and effectively.
On the other hand, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un offered Moscow his full support on the war in Ukraine during talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov's visit to North Korea is the latest in a series of high-profile trips by top Moscow officials as both the countries, Russia and North Korea, deepen military and political ties amid Moscow's offensive against Kyiv. Pyongyang sent thousands of troops to Russia's Kursk region to oust Ukrainian forces and provided the Russian army with artillery shells and missiles. Russia's foreign ministry posted a video on Telegram of the two men shaking hands and greeting each other with a hug and said the talks were held in Wonsan. North Korea's officials, KCNA news agency, said that Kim Jong-un and Lavrov met in an atmosphere full of camaraderie trust.
And in light of all that's happening, Ukraine is bleeding on all fronts. Ukrainian cities are once again under attack.
And these, of course, attacks are coming from airstrikes to ground offensives from all directions. Moscow is waging a war of exhaustion and Ukraine is now fighting to hold the line. As the battlefield burns, the US rushes fresh weapons into the conflict, hoping it's not too late. More in this next report. Take a look.
Russia is bleeding Ukraine dry with drones, missiles and a ruthless ground push. Ukraine is under siege. Russian firepower rains down across the country, missiles by night and ground assaults by day, drone swarms in between. The northeastern city of Kharkiv came under intense fire, with at least 17 explosions occurring in just 20 minutes. The attack comes a day after US President Donald Trump warned that Russian President Vladimir Putin has 50 days to strike a peace deal or face stiff tariffs from Washington. In the trenches, Ukrainian soldiers are exhausted. This is no longer a fast war, it's a war of attrition. Russia has been stepping up its summer offensive campaign, claiming more ground in eastern Ukraine while pounding it with combined drone, artillery and missile strikes. Ukrainian soldiers share their anguish.
Too many words have been promised by Trump. In my personal opinion, he is probably the most unstable person the U.S. has ever had. He says one thing, then changes his mind a week later and says something else, and gives people false hope.
That's definitely good. The only problem is that I'm worried that it might not be possible to provide such a huge amount of resources so quickly. But the more, the better. The more damage we inflict on them, the sooner they will have at least some desire to end the war.
The Russian offensive unfolds with unyielding determination. Russian forces are closing in on the eastern strongholds of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka in the Donetsk region, methodically capturing villages near both cities to try to cut key supply routes and envelop their defenders in a slow offensive that has unfolded for months. Military experts say that capturing those strongholds would allow Russia to push towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, setting the stage for the seizure of the entire Donetsk region. Ukraine is now waiting for the early delivery of American Patriot missile systems, which will provide much-needed firepower to block the Russian arsenal attack. A chronic shortage of manpower and ammunition has forced Ukrainian forces to focus on holding ground rather than launching counter-offensives. Bureau Report, Beyond World is One.
A stark fault line has fractured Western support for Ukraine. While President Trump pushes a sweeping multi-billion-dollar arms deal, key European powerhouses are reportedly opting out, sparking deep division over who pays for the escalating price of Kyiv's survival. Here's more.
Missiles roar across battlefields where Ukraine fights for survival. But behind the scenes, the fight for support grows just as fierce. President Donald Trump unveiled an ambitious plan for European nations to purchase billions of dollars in US-made weaponry, including vital Patriot missile systems, and funnel them directly to Ukraine.
Anything for it, but we will send it. It'll be business for us, and we will send them Patriots, which they desperately need, because Putin really surprised a lot of people.
However, the ink barely dried on the announcement before cracks began to appear, threatening to undermine the very solidarity Ukraine desperately needs. France and Italy are reportedly pulling out of the NATO-financed plan to buy US advanced weaponry for Ukraine. Paris, facing its own significant budget constraints, argues that diverting funds to US manufacturers would stifle its domestic arms sector and delay the continent's independent military buildup. European Union has publicly challenged Trump by bluntly insisting that the US must share the burden of arming Ukraine.
The call is that everybody would do the same. It's if you promise to give the weapons but say that somebody else is going to pay for it, it's not really given by you, is it?
There is also confusion over which nation would be sending the much-needed Patriot systems to Ukraine and when.
We must not have any illusions. A Patriot system that we now say should go to Ukraine will take months before it can be delivered. So we are now talking about days, perhaps weeks, until a decision is made. But then it will happen very quickly.
This simmering transatlantic tug-of-war over financial responsibility threatens to slow down the very weapons deliveries Ukraine so desperately needs, potentially prolonging the agony on the front lines. As Russia continues its brutal offensive, these internal Western divisions risk emboldening Moscow and deepening Ukraine's struggle.
Joining me live on the broadcast from Berlin is Dr. Volker Stansel, former German ambassador to China and senior distinguished fellow at SWP. German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Mr. Ambassador. How and when will the weapons reach Ukraine? Will they, first of all? And can you explain the internal procurement process of NATO?
Well, on your first question, I think it's impossible for anyone to reply with a definite point in time. And that is because the situation is very complicated and confusing, as you have also said. But the most important aspect is, I think, that we can be sure the fact won't be changed, that Europe will provide the arms that Ukraine bitterly needs, mainly, of course, arms to deal with the missile and drone attacks that presently happen every night in Ukraine. Why is the situation so complicated? First, the American side. As we all know, the MAGA supporters of Donald Trump don't want to have anything to do with wars outside of the United States. And I do not supporting Ukraine as President Biden did. So what President Trump does now is to tell his supporters, well, we're selling our arms, so we're making money with them. And that is something you won't oppose. Obviously, that works. It doesn't work as well for the Europeans, because as Ms. Callas said, you quoted her before, it's not the same thing if you tell someone, we will give you arms, and then you don't pay for them, but want somebody else to pay for them. So this makes the situation inside Europe pretty complicated. We have some countries that insist on having their own arms production, France among them. France, since the 1966, when de Gaulle withdrew from NATO, pursues a policy of strategic autonomy and to buy arms from America to give it then as a European country to Ukraine, of course, runs counter to that philosophy. The Italians have the same opinion, and so do the Czechs, and maybe some other countries that I don't know about. So these countries will also deliver arms, and France has said so, Italy has said so, but arms from their own supplies, not from American supplies. And the countries that are left presently, it's four, it's Germany, it's, I think, two Scandinavian countries and the UK. They will use American-made arms that they have presently in their stockpiles so that they can deliver them relatively quickly. Now, delivering arms is something that takes time. It will take time, as you have just heard from the German Minister of Defense. But as I said in the beginning, the basic point is that Ukraine finally will get the arms that it needs.
And can we go back to the funds? And as you mentioned, all of this is very confusing for someone that's watching afar. Will the Europeans pay individually, or will NATO create a separate mechanism for this multi-billion-dollar weapons purchase from the United States?
Well, that's a technical question, it seems to me. Will Mr. Rutte create a fund and gather the monies from the countries that want to pay, that are willing to pay to the Americans, or are countries such as Germany individually going to pay? As this whole structure has been negotiated by the German Minister of Defense over a pretty long time, I think that is a question they have already dealt with, but it has not come out into the open yet. I don't see it as a problematic question at all. It is a question how to technically deal with the question of how to do the payment to the United States. So this is not the problem. The problem is, as again the German Minister of Defense said, the speed with which arms need to be delivered, and this is a speed that presently cannot be guaranteed. It will take some time. The minister spoke of some days, maybe some weeks. This, I think, is a question we have to look at hardly.
And finally, President Trump's 50-day deadline to Vladimir Putin and the promise of weapons to Ukraine. What tangible changes can we expect on the battlefield and perhaps Putin's behavior?
Well, what we see so far is Putin reassuring his countrymen that Russia will continue the policy it is pursuing, which is the war, obviously, and is not afraid of anything that the Europeans or the Americans are going to do. So I think we have to expect attacks, nightly attacks on Kyiv and other cities and areas in Ukraine in the near future. I do not think Putin will want to give the impression that he's giving in to the American president, who has declared that he is disappointed with Putin. Putin will not want to be the weaker of the two here in the public, in the media, in the West. So I think first we will have to expect that the war is going on, which makes it so urgent, as I said before, that the arms Europe is going to deliver are delivered quickly.
Dr. Stansel, thank you so much for joining us on WION and for your thorough analysis. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
All right, and moving on, Russia says it continues to view NATO as a significant threat to its national security due to its military capabilities and planned increase in military spending. Well, this as it continued to conduct airstrikes on eastern Ukraine. At least 2 people have been killed and 22 others have been wounded in the latest Russian attacks on a shopping area in Dobropilya in eastern Ukraine. Now, according to regional authorities, Russia dropped a 500-kilogram bomb on Dobropilya, destroying 54 shops and 13 buildings around the crowded square. Condemning the Russian airstrike, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said there was no military justification for the attack.
Це просто жахливий, тупий російський терор.
This is just horrific, senseless Russian terror. There is no military sense in their strikes, only an attempt to take as many lives as possible. All of Russia today is engaged in such despicable strikes. We will respond. We will work with our partners to force Russia to end the war.
Будемо працювати з партнерами заради того.
Now, as Ukraine waits for promised U.S. military aid to help fight Russians, young recruits are joining the fight against Russian forces and are being trained in Kyiv. Ukrainian youth are to join the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade as intense battle on Ukraine's front line rages on. Meanwhile, Sergei Shoigu, Russian Security Council Secretary, criticized NATO's latest summit, calling it Trump's summit. He accused European countries of succumbing to U.S. pressure to increase defense spending to 5% of the GDP by 2035. Now, he cited the alliance's militarization and the European Union's defense build-up as risks to global stability. The European Union executive proposed a $2.3 trillion long-term budget focused on tackling overseas competition and Russian aggression, but it was quickly shot down by Germany, the bloc's largest member. Well, the budget earmarked up to 100 billion euros for the reconstruction of war-torn Ukraine, as well as substantial new flexibility funds kept available in event of crisis. Now, Germany said that EU budget was not acceptable at a time when all member states are making considerable efforts to consolidate their national budgets.
We are setting aside 100 billion euros for Ukraine. You know, we have the Ukraine facility for reconstruction. It was initially, with the midterm review, filled with 50 billion. These are slowly but surely going down in the amounts, and therefore we are suggesting 100 billion euros to fill up again the Ukraine facility to support recovery, resilience, and of course their path to the EU membership.
Now, as the war in Ukraine rages on, Russia is ramping up its infrastructure development. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited the Magnitogorsk iron and steel works in the east of Ural Mountains, boosting the morale of his workers.
Более 70% всех наших выбросов измеряется онлайн постоянно датчиками.
All right, and moving on, Russia says it continues to view NATO as a significant threat to its national security due to its military capabilities and planned increase in military spending. Well, this as it continued to conduct airstrikes on eastern Ukraine. At least 2 people have been killed and 22 others have been wounded in the latest Russian attacks on a shopping area in Dobropilya in eastern Ukraine. Now, according to regional authorities, Russia dropped a 500-kilogram bomb on Dobropilya, destroying 54 shops and 13 buildings around the crowded square. Condemning the Russian airstrike, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said there was no military justification for the attack.
Це просто жахливий, тупий російський терор.
This is just horrific, senseless Russian terror. There is no military sense in their strikes, only an attempt to take as many lives as possible. All of Russia today is engaged in such despicable strikes. We will respond. We will work with our partners to force Russia to end the war.
Будемо працювати з партнерами заради того.
Now, as Ukraine waits for promised U.S. military aid to help fight Russians, young recruits are joining the fight against Russian forces and are being trained in Kyiv. Ukrainian youth are to join the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade as intense battle on Ukraine's front line rages on. Meanwhile, Sergei Shoigu, Russian Security Council Secretary, criticized NATO's latest summit, calling it Trump's summit. He accused European countries of succumbing to U.S. pressure to increase defense spending to 5% of the GDP by 2035. Now he cited the alliance's militarization and the European Union's defense build-up as risks to global stability. The European Union executive proposed a $2.3 trillion long-term budget focused on tackling overseas competition and Russian aggression, but it was quickly shot down by Germany, the bloc's largest member. Well, the budget earmarked up to 100 billion euros for the reconstruction of war-torn Ukraine, as well as substantial new flexibility funds kept available in event of crisis. Now, Germany said that EU budget was not acceptable at a time when all member states are making considerable efforts to consolidate their national budgets.
We are setting aside 100 billion euros for Ukraine. You know we have the Ukraine facility for reconstruction. It was initially, with the midterm review, filled with 50 billion. These are slowly but surely going down in the amounts, and therefore we are suggesting 100 billion euros to fill up again the Ukraine facility to support recovery, resilience, and of course their path to the EU membership.
Now, as the war in Ukraine rages on, Russia is ramping up its infrastructure development. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited the Magnitogorsk iron and steel works in the east of Ural Mountains, boosting the morale of his workers.
Более 70% всех наших выбросов измеряется онлайн постоянно датчиками.
All right, so let's start with some breaking news that has just come in, where Russia has begun exercises of its Yars intercontinental ballistic missile system in what is being seen as another attempt by Moscow to show off its nuclear strength. Russia tested out its deadliest strategic weapon. The Russian Defense Ministry's latest video reveals a massive missile launcher moving in the dead of the night. Now, the Yars missile system represents the pinnacle of Russia's nuclear capabilities. Each launcher potentially carries up to 4 independently targeted warheads with a total launch weight of about 49,000 kilograms and a staggering maximum range of 10,500 kilometers. The missile has the capability to maneuver during flight and deploy both active and passive decoys, which gives Yars the advantage against modern missile defense systems. Now, Moscow regularly holds drills using the nuclear-capable missiles, and by executing these large-scale field movements, the Russian Strategic Missile Force has demonstrated its readiness for protracted operations under combat conditions. The new drills involve the nuclear-capable missile is a development that comes amidst heightened geopolitical activity, as European leaders are now pushing the Trump administration to take a much harder stance against Moscow. Now, Russia has begun exercises with its Yars intercontinental ballistic missile system in what is being seen as another attempt by Moscow to exhibit its nuclear strength. Now, Russia, in fact, tested out its deadliest strategic weapon. The Russian Defense Ministry's latest video reveals the massive missile launcher moving in the dead of the night in a show of nuclear strength. Now, the Yars missile system represents the pinnacle of Russia's nuclear capabilities. Each launcher potentially carries up to 4 independently targetable warheads with a total launch weight of 49,000 kilograms and a staggering maximum range of 10,500 kilograms. The missile has the capability to maneuver during flight and deploy both active and passive decoys, which gives Yars the advantage against modern missile defense systems. Now, Moscow regularly holds drills using the nuclear-capable missiles by executing large-scale field movements. The Russian strategic missile forces have demonstrated their readiness for protracted operations under combat conditions. The new drill involving the nuclear-capable missile is a development that comes amidst heightened geopolitical activity as European leaders are pushing the Trump administration to take a harder stance against Moscow.
Russia has launched a new wave of drone barrage on Ukraine, and this time around, Russian strikes hit Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv. The drone attack on Kharkiv damaged a maternity hospital located in the center of the city. Patients rushed to take shelter as windows were shattered. Shards of glass fell on the beds.
It was very scary because I was so full of adrenaline that I probably forgot that I had stitches. Now I am slowly recovering from the shock.
One Russian Iskander missile destroyed a Ukrainian armed forces deployment area in Nikolaev. Video shared by the Russian Defense Ministry showed the Ukrainian camp being blown into pieces due to the strike. The ministry said Russian troops used high-precision, long-range weapons and drones to hit these spots. Russia said it intercepted 155 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles from late Thursday into Friday morning, most of which were over the Kursk region bordering Ukraine. Russia's Defense Ministry has also said that the Russian army repelled multiple attacks by the Ukrainian army in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, destroying a large number of military equipment of the Ukrainian army. In fact, Ukraine said it intercepted 382 air targets. This is the second consecutive day that Ukraine was hit by large-scale airstrikes. As per reports, 8 locations in the country were hit by Russian airstrikes. In an interview to NBC, the U.S. president expressed his disappointment with the Russian president and said that he will make a major statement on Moscow on Monday. Trump's team will also identify arms from U.S. stockpiles to send to Ukraine under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, with one saying that it could be worth around $300 million. The package could include defensive Patriot missiles and offensive medium-range rockets. The U.S. Secretary of State has said that most U.S. military aid to Ukraine continues on schedule and accused European countries of not sharing unused Patriot batteries with Ukraine. The UK Prime Minister, meanwhile, and the French President have announced plans for a coalition of the willing. Peacekeeping force is ready to go, but once a ceasefire is agreed between Russia and Ukraine. Going straight across now to our esteemed guest with us on the broadcast. Let me just, for the benefit of our viewers, ask you to elaborate for us the immediate implications of what we are seeing on the ground, especially with the intensification of the Russian aerial attacks on Ukraine over the last couple of days. What do you think is the strategy of Moscow at this point?
Well, thanks very much, Molly, for having me back on your program. I think the general assumption in Washington, D.C. was that it would be possible to achieve some kind of an agreement with Russia in which all sides basically got to save face. The West, Ukraine, and Russia simultaneously. But nonetheless, such an agreement would require, in effect, Russia to acknowledge that Ukraine is going to be a heavily hostile state on its border and heavily armed as well. And Russia currently on the ground believes that it is winning this war, it is gaining territory, it is keeping up the pressure on Ukraine, and it thinks it has the opportunity here to achieve more of its aims, to turn Ukraine de facto into a genuinely neutral country with stricter limits on the size of its military. So that's the calculation in Moscow right now.
Let's also talk about what the role of the United States can be and should be at this point, according to you.
Yes, I think it's unfortunate that the Trump administration has been focusing its efforts so much on trying to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine, because that really reveals the extent to which President Trump is not particularly interested in the complex details of what kind of a negotiation would actually be necessary here. Because the war between Russia and Ukraine is not just a war between those two countries, it's actually a nested conflict within a broader set of long-standing, decades-long disputes over the European security order and what shape that security order should take, right? Who gets to make the rules, who gets to enforce those rules, etc. And that's what Russia here is trying to do. It's trying to shape its future role vis-a-vis that security order. And that requires talking about a whole bunch of issues, including Ukraine, but not just related to Ukraine. It also involves questions concerning the future economic shape of the continental order, also questions about arms control and strategic stability, and much, much more. And so doing that is going to require multiple different negotiation tracks with different constellations of actors all operating at the same time. And it's very difficult to achieve an agreement on that front, especially when you've got different sets of interests, between Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States.
Right. Also, the role of the EU here. In the latest, the French president, for example, stressing on the need to pressurize Vladimir Putin for a ceasefire. But at the same time, there's also that sense of pessimism that comes with it, because there's been a lot of talk about that happening, but no forward movement, really.
Indeed, and as I've said, I think it's a mistake on the part of not just the Trump administration, but also Ukraine and Europe to be backing just a ceasefire, because what Russia is interested in here is not just a ceasefire, but a broader political settlement of the conflict that allows Russia to be able to assume a role in the European security order that it deems to be commensurate with its status. And that's something that Europe in particular is just not interested in talking about right now as a matter of principle, and also because Europe feels quite insecure right now, not only because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also because of the fact that the Trump administration has put the future of the transatlantic alliance, very much into question. So all of this makes for a very, very difficult situation to get all the stars to align at the same time. And right now, given that the parties have not arrived at a stalemate, it makes perfect sense that Moscow is going to try to push to get as much as it possibly can here. And we can only hope that this does not encourage the West to escalate, even further in a tit-for-tat fashion that ultimately leaves us all extremely less secure. Of course, the worst-case outcome could be a tit-for-tat escalation that leads to a nuclear exchange. We seem to be further away from that today than we were in the autumn of 2022. But let's not lose sight of the fact that Russia does have core interests here. So does Ukraine, and so does Europe. And so when the stakes are very high, it does lead, sometimes for various actors to take actions that they believe can be rational, but ultimately lead to a very, very destructive outcome.
All right, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Molly.
So Russia is changing its strategy. Moscow's drone war is now sweeping across Ukraine from eastern cities to the once quiet west. Ukraine is struggling to keep up, shooting down hundreds but urging the world for more defense aid. All this ahead of Trump's major announcement on Russia on Monday. Here's a report.
Ukraine is under siege. Russia is pounding Ukraine with hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles for the fourth consecutive day. Moscow has fired nearly 600 Shahed drones targeting the western cities of Lviv, Bukovina, and the already hard-hit east. The relentless strikes have left Ukrainians scrambling for shelter.
In the bomb shelter, we could hear explosions and drones flying above us, and we saw the destructions on our street.
Moscow has unleashed its bombing campaign by targeting cities of Chernivtsi, Lviv, Lutsk, Bukovina in the west to Kharkiv and Sumy in the east. Experts say this isn't an outlier, this is Kremlin's new strategy. Russia knows when and how to carry out the precision strikes. Western cities are not far from Russia's targets. Russia is showing off its nuclear muscle. It is moving its deadliest strategic weapon, Yar's missile, for its night drills. The intercontinental ballistic missile system is designed to carry multiple nuclear warheads, travel over 10,000 kilometers, and evade missile defense with sophisticated decoys. This isn't a drill for domestic training, this is a postcard to a nuclear reminder, right as conventional strikes peak. And as the smoke clears, Ukraine looks westward. President Zelenskyy has confirmed US military aid has resumed. After a temporary freeze, crucial supplies including Patriot systems are reportedly on the way. President Zelenskyy is also urging for tougher sanctions on Russia, but the biggest shift has come from Washington. President Trump, for the first time since returning to office, is using presidential drawdown authority, allowing arms to be sent directly from American stockpiles, and NATO is buying US Patriots to supply Ukraine, with Germany, Norway, and other European states footing the bill.
Russian drones hit a maternity hospital in Ukraine overnight. I know. You'll be seeing things happening.
The clock is ticking, as President Trump is set to make a major announcement on Russia on Monday. No one knows what it will be, but everyone knows what it could mean. For Ukraine, it could be the difference between holding the line or losing the sky. Bureau report, we on, world is one.
All right, now joining us in the broadcast, we've got retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's a military expert and also the host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. Colonel Davis, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us here on WION. Now, looking at what has unfolded in the Ukraine war in the course of the last week, where Russia has carried out repeatedly, sending hundreds of drones into different Ukrainian territories to stage these attacks. In your assessment, what is Russia trying to accomplish here?
Listen, Russia is very clear on this. There should be no ambiguity. I think one of the biggest problems is that very few in the West want to actually listen to what they're saying, because what they're saying and what they're doing are commensurate. What they said is that they will either end this war via negotiations, and they laid out the conditions at the second Istanbul meeting a month or so ago to the Ukrainian side, or they say very plainly they will keep fighting on the ground and they will keep fighting in the air until they seize by force of arms what they want. And they are doing exactly what they said they were going to do. Meanwhile, you have the West not willing to support any of that. Certainly the Ukraine side is not willing to submit to those very draconian measures. We got to be clear on that. But you have, like Germany, just announced that they're accelerating the delivery of long-range missile fire with the Taurus into Ukraine to use deep into Russia, in, quote, high triple-digit numbers. So the Western side continues to ramp up capabilities. You obviously have Trump, you just mentioned it ago, is now going to turn on a little bit more of the U.S. weapons. The European Union and NATO and individual European countries are ramping it up too. So you have both sides continuing to ramp up military capabilities, and nobody is looking at getting this thing peacefully done. So this is going to get worse before it gets better, I'm afraid. It's going to get worse is the prediction that you're putting out. But also weigh in on what Donald Trump said this week, that, he in fact berated Vladimir Putin in a manner that he's never done before since he's assumed presidency. He said that when he talks to Putin, he hears a lot of nice things that are said, but nothing actually happens in Russia taking steps towards a ceasefire. With that being the case, what approach do you think Donald Trump will now take to try and bring about some kind of a ceasefire, if that is at all possible? Well, this is another puzzling and problematic issue here, because this all stems from the July 3rd phone call between Trump and Putin, when Trump, reported by both sides, actually asked again for an unconditional ceasefire from the Russian side. The Russian side, very politely, even according to their own readouts, said, no, we're not going to do that. Until all the core issues have been settled and our conditions have been met, we're going to continue fighting, and we are non-negotiable on that. And I don't know why the U.S. president thought that just because he asked Russia to do that they would say yes, because there's militarily no reason for them to agree to an unconditional ceasefire when they're in the position of advantage. But Trump got mad because they didn't, and now he says, first of all, we've released and taken the pause back off of the missiles we're sending, and now I suspect that on Monday they're going to announce both an increase in the amount of ammunition and weapons we're going to send to Ukraine and also a sanctions package, which Senator Lindsey Graham has been basically begging to get done for a long time. And I think those are probably the two things that are going to get done. But everybody needs to be clear that is going to have no impact at all on the fighting. It's not going to cause Russia any more harm. It may hurt them a little bit more, but it won't change the outcome. It won't change their air superiority. It won't change the Ukraine's ability to defend against these missiles around the margins only. But Russia clearly has enough air weapons to continue to saturate the air, so no matter how many more Patriots you send, it won't be enough. And these kinds of destructions, like you showed a minute ago, will simply continue on, and the fighting on the ground will continue moving forward to the west.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Davis, for joining us with that perspective then.
Thank you very much.
Russia continues its relentless aerial bombardment on Ukraine. Moscow launched a massive missile and drone strike overnight that extended from Kharkiv and Sumy regions to Lviv and Bukovina. Now, in a post on X, Zelenskyy claimed that Russia launched 26 cruise missiles and 597 attack drones, over half of which were Shahed drones. Zelenskyy further claimed that over 20 missiles and a vast majority of drones were destroyed by the Ukrainian Air Force. At least 2 people have been reportedly killed and around 20 have been injured in the attack. Now, calling for swift decision to deter Moscow, Zelenskyy has demanded tougher sanctions on Russia, more air defense and investment in interceptor drones. Now, amidst the aerial assault, the Russian army has shared a video of combat training by assault troops on the 25th Combined Arms Army. The video shows Russian troops practicing various attack patterns on enemy positions. Well, this comes as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is visiting North Korea, where he met Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. Speaking during a meeting between the two sides, Lavrov praised the North Korean leadership for contributing to the cause of liberating Russian territories.
We are sincerely grateful to the leadership of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, all military personnel, soldiers, and officers who demonstrated excellent combat training and made a very important contribution to the just cause of liberating Russian territories.
Lavrov's visit is the latest among a series of meetings between top Moscow and North Korean officials. In June last year, Russia and North Korea had signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, signaling deepening military partnership between Pyongyang and Moscow. Now joining us on the broadcast from Wicklow Island is Scott Lucas. He's a professor of international politics, Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast.
Thank you.
The U.S. has resumed military aid to Ukraine and is sending its special envoy, Keith Kellogg, according to President Zelenskyy. Now, it's just after pausing certain weapons delivery to Ukraine. Now, according to you, what does this shift signal about Washington's evolving stance on the war?
Well, I think overall, it signals that Donald Trump's idea that he could work directly with Vladimir Putin to, effectively support the Russian invasion while proclaiming that he was ending the war. That's not working. Quite clearly, with these strikes that you've talked about, with the effort to advance on the ground, although Russia's taking very little new territory, they're not willing to compromise. Vladimir Putin's goal is, as it has been for the past 40 months, to conquer Ukraine, to make it part of Greater Russia. Now, that means that Trump can't rely on Putin to get him that Nobel Peace Prize. But what does it mean in terms of U.S. support for Ukraine? I think that depends on 2 issues. The first is Donald Trump is very unpredictable. He's very chaotic, as you know. So he said, now I am authorizing U.S. military aid to Ukraine. I will sell Patriot air defense systems to NATO members to give to Ukraine, but could he change his mind? And I think even more important, the Trump administration is other officials, and they are divided over how far to support Ukraine. You have some like Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, who will be there on Monday. I think he very firmly wants to make sure Ukraine can continue to resist the Russian invasion. You have others like the Vice President J.D. Vance, who I think have signaled in the past that they would walk away from European security and Ukrainian security. Which group gets the ascendancy? A lot of that will depend on infighting within Washington, but it also depends on the ongoing skill of Ukraine and its European partners to encourage Washington to join them in what is a necessary resistance against Moscow.
Right, Professor Lucas, and President Zelenskyy has also called for tougher international sanctions against Russia to deter further aggression. Now, how likely is it that we'll see any strong action anytime soon?
I think in terms of the U.S., I think it'll be limited, at least in terms of the White House, because Donald Trump still has this idea that you can trade with Russia, which is a fantasy, but he holds on to it. However, the U.S. Congress is moving towards tougher sanctions on Russia. We saw the two sponsors of the sanctions legislation meet with Zelenskyy this week. That's Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal. Can they get this bill through Congress in the next few weeks? And if Trump threatens to override it, can they, or veto it, can they override that veto? That's one issue. But I think even before that is, can the European pass its 18th package of sanctions? These would be much tougher sanctions on Russian energy, on Russian banks. There are a couple of countries that are holding out against it, Hungary and Slovakia. Will they stop the resistance of this sanctions legislation, which can be significant if the EU does adopt it in restricting Russia's revenues for its war?
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Lucas, for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you to you.
For 2 harrowing days, the skies over Ukraine have been ablaze. A relentless storm of drones and missiles have rained down destruction. And amidst this terrifying aerial onslaught, one weapon has stood out. And our next story takes a close look at the new upgraded version of the Russian Iskander-M missiles, which are proving to be unstoppable at the moment.
इसमें 8 लोग यात्रा कर रहे थे, जिसमें 5 इंजर्ड हुए हैं और 5 को सीआरपी और पुलिस ने मिलकर हॉस्पिटल भिजवा दिया हमने।
A chilling new chapter unfolds as Russia deploys its formidable Iskander missile, dubbed the Patriot Killer, demonstrating its devastating precision against Ukrainian targets and escalating the brutal air war to a new level. These images released by the Russian Defense Ministry claim to show an Iskander missile striking an American Patriot missile defense system in Ukraine. The very air shakes with raw destructive power as Russian forces unleash an unprecedented barrage across Ukraine. Drones swarmed, followed by the terrifying whistle of cruise missiles, each a harbinger of chaos. Cities braced, air defense systems strained, but nothing could fully withstand the sheer volume and ferocity of the assault. Then the true horror descended, the Iskander. These tactical ballistic missiles, known for their speed and maneuverability, struck with surgical, annihilating precision. One such devastating strike utterly obliterated a Ukrainian temporary deployment point, turning the site to dust in a flash of pulverizing force. Again, Russia said it used an Iskander missile in this attack. The sheer scale of the destruction underscored the grim reality. Russia is escalating its aerial campaign, employing its most advanced weapons